a king sat down and wrote his final letter. Enemy ships were already burning his city as he wrote it. The message ends with the same line twice. Our city is sacked. May you know it. May you know it. That letter was never answered. Weeks later, the city of Ugarit, one of the richest ports on the Mediterranean, was ash. Ugarit wasn't alone. Within a few decades, the Hittite Empire, one of the great powers of its age, vanished completely. The Mycenaeans collapsed, the Minoans disappeared, the Trojans were gone. Babylon was left crippled, weak, and barely standing. This was the late Bronze Age, interconnected empires stretching from Greece to Egypt to Mesopotamia, trading, writing, building on a massive scale. And then, in the span of a single human lifetime, almost all of it simply stopped existing entirely, everywhere at once. What actually killed a world this connected, this advanced, and this fast is still argued over by historians today. The story starts with a group Egyptian scribes gave one chilling, vague name to, a name that still confuses experts. They're called the Sea Peoples, a name actually coined centuries later by a 19th century Egyptologist studying the records. Nobody knows exactly where they came from. Egyptian records simply call them marauding invaders who appeared almost from nowhere. In 1192 BCE, they hit Egypt for the first time and were defeated by Pharaoh Merneptah's army. 15 years later, in 1177 BCE, they returned in far greater numbers under Pharaoh Ramesses III. But before that second battle, the Sea Peoples had already torn through the entire eastern Mediterranean coastline, city after city. They destroyed Ugarit, the same port city whose king's desperate letter never reached anyone in time to help. They sacked Hattusa, the Hittite capital, crippling an empire that had ruled Anatolia for nearly 500 years. They raided Cyprus and disrupted its copper mines, and copper was the one ingredient every bronze weapon depended on. They fought with a sword called the Now-2, a cut-and-thrust bronze blade sharper than anything local kingdoms carried. Round shields, horned helmets, an enemy nobody could fully identify, moving by land and by sea at the same time. If Egypt actually managed to beat them in battle, why didn't Egypt come out of this collapse unscathed either? And Egypt was next in line, about to face the largest wave of these attackers the empire had ever seen. Ramesses III began mobilizing everything the empire had left, every soldier, every ship, every resource in Egypt. The battle happened at the Nile Delta, and a second clash further north in a region called Jahi, near modern Israel. Egypt won both battles. It's carved in stone on the walls of Ramesses' own temple, a scene of burning ships. That carving, at a temple called Medinet Habu, shows a massive naval battle, drowning enemies, and a triumphant pharaoh. For a moment, it looked like Egypt had stopped the collapse cold, right before it reached its own borders. But victory has a price, and this particular one nearly bankrupted one of the most powerful empires on earth. The war drained Egypt's treasury and killed enough soldiers that the empire never fully recovered its old strength. Egypt technically survived the Sea Peoples. It simply never stopped declining afterward, slipping slowly into weakness for generations to come. So if Egypt actually won, and the Sea Peoples alone can't explain empires that never even fought them directly, Something bigger was clearly happening underneath the entire collapse, something that had nothing to do with any single battle. That question, what was the real cause hiding behind the invasion, is the one that changed how this story gets told. In 2014, historian Eric Klein published a book that reframed the entire Bronze Age collapse from scratch. His argument: no single cause, not even the Sea Peoples, could have taken down that many empires at once. Ugarit's own letters mention something else happening at the exact same time as the attacks: a devastating drought and famine. Archaeologists have found evidence of earthquakes striking multiple Bronze Age cities within that same narrow window of years. The Bronze Age economy was extremely interdependent: tin from one region, copper from another, grain shipped across the sea. Cities that couldn't feed themselves relied entirely on trade routes stretching across the whole Mediterranean, with almost no backup plan. When those trade routes broke, from raids, drought, or earthquakes, the entire interconnected system had no backup plan at all. Klein's theory is a perfect storm: drought weakening harvests, famine triggering unrest, and earthquakes destroying infrastructure all at once. Then raiders arrived to finish off kingdoms that were already failing from the inside, long before a single sword was drawn. The Sea Peoples weren't the whole story, after all. They were the last blow against a world already breaking apart. There's an even stranger twist buried inside that same theory, one that flips the entire villain of this story around. Some historians now think the Sea Peoples themselves were refugees, driven from their own homes by those very same disasters. Victims and aggressors, at the same time, pushed toward richer lands that were already quietly collapsing on their own. Blamed for centuries for a disaster they most likely didn't start alone, and likely never fully understood themselves. After the dust finally settled, the Mediterranean entered a dark age that lasted for several hundred years in near silence. Writing systems vanished in Greece. Monumental building stopped completely. Entire skills disappeared, along with the people who knew them. Not every group vanished, though. One defeated faction of the Sea Peoples, called the Peliset, settled along the coast of Canaan. Historians believe they became the Philistines of the Iron Age, a people whose name still echoes in history today. It would take Greece centuries to write again, and centuries more to build anything close to what it had lost. The empires that looked eternal in 1180 BCE were almost entirely gone by 1150, just 30 years later. Nobody alive at the time fully understood why their entire connected world was disappearing around them, piece by piece. The honest answer, even now, is that no single villain did it. Not the Sea Peoples, not the drought alone. Drought, famine, earthquakes, broken trade, and one unstoppable group of raiders all arrived within the exact same narrow window. An interconnected world turned out to be exactly as fragile as it looked impressive from the outside, right up until it wasn't. The Bronze Age didn't fall to one enemy walking through the front door of history with a sword raised. It fell because everything was connected to everything else, and every single piece of that system failed at once. 3,000 years later, archaeologists are still piecing together a collapse that took less time than one human life. And the letter that started this story, "Our city is sacked," still sits in a museum, still waiting to be answered.